So today I'm going to talk about a new methodology called plotting. And this is a way for us to make user interviews visible. As most of us here are researchers, designers, and PMs, most of us have run user interviews before. And so we should be familiar with the constraints and limitations of user interviews. Namely, there's always a wealth of information, too much information to dive into in a short, constrained period of time. So what I'm going to do is, I promised I would talk about food, so let's talk about food, specifically breakfast. And I'm going to try something new here. I'm going to get a brave volunteer to come up here and do a mock interview with me about breakfast items. So we're going to talk about your breakfast preferences and so on. So who wants to come up here for a mock interview? Come on up. Go ahead. So thank you so much for volunteering. The view actually up here is not that bad.
Okay. Hello.
So my name is Jing Jing. You are?
Paulina.
Hi, Paulina. Thank you for volunteering again. And so today we're going to pretend that I work for a CPG company, and I want to learn about your attitudes and behaviors around breakfast items. So Paulina, what do you like to eat for breakfast?
Eggs in any shape or form.
That's it? That's all? So how do you cook your eggs?
It depends. If there's boiled eggs in the fridge, I would have those. If there's time, I might spice it up with a omelet. If there's mounds of time, I'll make a poached egg.
Oh, so it depends on time constraints. Do you like eggs with anything else?
Yes. Sometimes fruit, sometimes salad, sometimes things in the omelet, sometimes bread. Yeah.
So she's already mentioned a couple of different items, and I want to dive deeper into each of the items. So you mentioned you sometimes eat fruits with your eggs. So when do you choose fruits over salads for your eggs?
When I am working on appearing to be more healthy.
Truth, right there, appearing to be more healthy. What about, you mentioned cereal or milk? Was it cereal or milk?
Sometimes. No, I did not mention cereal. No.
What was the last thing that you mentioned?
Salad? Bread? Bread, I mentioned, yeah.
So when do you choose to have bread?
When I know I have a hard day and I need those carbs.
And how do you prepare your bread?
I grab it from the bag and I eat it. If I want to be fancy, and again, if I have time, I might even just toast it on the pan and put an egg on top. So.
Interesting. Yeah. Cool, awesome. Thank you so much for talking to me about food.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paulina. And so that was a very fun way to chat about food, breakfast, and so on. But what you'll notice is Paulina mentioned a bunch of different breakfast items, and I was very interested in diving deep into some of them in more depth. So I had follow-up questions about a bunch of them, and I had to retrieve those items from memory, diving deep into each, and so on. And so, essentially, with user interviews, they are great for conversational storytelling, but really only one thread at a time. To make it worse, our brains are not built for a lot of information. And that's because our working memories, our memory systems, are limited. And also, we experience what's called cognitive load, when there is more information than we have capabilities to process them. What does that look like in actuality? So in terms of how our brain and memory works, I want us to focus on three things: attention, long-term memory, and working memory. Okay, so what I'll do is, animation doesn't work that well, so I'll just refer back to this slide. For the top portion, you'll notice attention. This is the resource that we use to perceive information from the world. So sensory information comes in, and through attention and gets held within my brain. Long-term memory is where we have long-term information, so memory from the past that I might want to retrieve to use and to process. And the most important part is working memory. Working memory actually has two functions. One is it is a temporary storage for information, and another function is you can actually manipulate information while it is in working memory. So you can process it, you can manipulate it. I want to talk about two processes involved with these three components. The first is the encoding process. So information comes in from the world, and I choose to focus my attention on it, and then it gets held in my working memory as I try to process it and decide what to encode into long-term memory. So working memory is used as a temporary storage for me to process and hold that information from the world. In terms of the reverse, retrieval, information from long-term memory is being retrieved and again held temporarily in working memory for me to process and decide what to do with it. So you can tell that working memory is very, very crucial in how we function and our day-to-day. The problem now with working memory is that it is temporary and it is limited in capacity. It's temporary because we can really only hold things for 15 to 30 seconds. And it's limited in storage because on average, we can really only hold about 7 items. 7 items, 15 to 30 seconds. Not a lot of processing power. And this is where cognitive load happens. When we have more information that's out in the world that we want to process, then we have capabilities for processing that information. We experience cognitive load. So as you can imagine, cognitive load applies in user interviews as well. And that applies to both the interviewer and the interviewee. As an interviewee, they are actively retrieving information from long-term memory, holding it within working memory, deciding how to share that with you, the researcher, and doing all of that within a short period of time. Likewise, for a researcher, we also have a lot of cognitive load. We have to pay attention to what is being shared with us. We have to hold that information in our working memories. We have to decide what to encode into long-term memory. And we also have to decide what to probe deeper into based on what people are saying. So as you can tell, lots of information, not a lot of space up here to process all that information. Fortunately, though, we have developed cognitive aids to help us. So we're all familiar with cognitive aids. These are things like checklists, glossaries, concept maps. These allow us to offload some of the demands on working memory onto a more physical form, so we don't have to hold it all up here. Now that we've talked about how working memory works and also cognitive load, how would this apply to user interviews? How can we make user interviews less cognitively demanding and more visible? Introducing plotting. Plotting is a working term, but essentially, it is a combination of concept mapping and the think out loud protocol. The goal of plotting is really to interactively gauge at people's mental models, so interviewees' mental models, through conversation and through visual representation. And so first, in our breakfast example, I needed to capture all of the different ways, different breakfast items that Paulina likes to eat. So eggs, salad, fruit, bread, all of those raw elements are captured onto individual sticky notes. This capturing could happen by her or by me. So it could be me listening to her talking about her breakfast experiences, and I'm noting down the different items that I want to talk about later on. Or she could write down the different items based on the question that I asked. So she could note down the different types of eggs, different types of bread, and so on. That's the first phase. The second phase is where the interactivity happens. So as we're doing this, capturing all the raw notes, we're doing this on a shared document that can be viewed by both of us, a shared board. And what I'm going to ask Paulina to do is then plot each raw element, so each content piece, each breakfast item, against a visual framework that I predefined. So before the interview, I would come in and decide on a visual framework to use for this particular research question and have her interactively plot out her pieces against the framework that I've chosen. She is doing that real time, and she is doing that while thinking out loud, so I can follow along on some of her rationale and thought processes. The goal is really for me as a researcher to gain a more nuanced understanding of how the concepts are structured and relate to each other in her mind. So essentially, her mental model. We talked about making user interviews more visible, so let's do that. Let's go back to our breakfast item example, and let's pretend that I did plotting with Paulina on breakfast items. And so, after the first question, I asked her, what do you like to have for breakfast? Either she or I would write out on individual sticky notes the items that she prefers to eat. And so this is a visual way for both of us to see what are the items that she prefers. And it's also a way for me to gauge what I want to do with this information moving forward. Then I'm going to pre-prepare visual frameworks for her to interactively show me her mental models. And I'm going to share 4 frameworks. The first one is categorical plotting. This is similar to card sorting in that, if you remember the breakfast items, the raw notes that we had in the previous slide, I'm now going to ask Paulina to group them based on categories, group them based on how she perceives the relationships to be between those items. These could be close categories, so these could be predefined by me ahead of the interview, or they could be categories that Paulina herself decides on the go. And the goal here is to really understand how items and concepts relate in people's minds. And remember, as Paulina is doing this grouping and the categorization, she is thinking out loud so I can follow along with her rationale. So maybe what she does is she categorizes all of the breakfast items in this way. So you can see that there's different scenarios already emerging based on what breakfast items she would choose in different situations. So maybe when she is running low on time, she opts for things like cereal milk, sliced fruits, so that these are more grab-and-go, quick and easy breakfast options. Maybe when she has done a workout and she needs to replenish protein, she would choose more protein-heavy breakfast items. For those of you who are familiar with the Jobs to be Done framework, you can also see some parallels between this and Jobs to be Done. Essentially, we're already starting to see the different jobs that people would hire breakfast items for in different situations. So here you can see some people hire grab-and-go breakfast items for situations where they didn't have a lot of time. They will hire those types of breakfast items. And then in other situations, they will hire more protein-rich options for replenishing their protein storage. Another framework that we can use, a visual framework, is dimensional plotting. So this would refer to a continuous dimension, in which case the raw nodes, the raw elements, will be placed against the continuous dimension. And again, as people are doing this, they are thinking out loud and showing us how the concepts relate in their minds. This really helps us to surface how concepts rank in people's minds. So maybe for part of my interview, I will ask Paulina to rank the breakfast items on a continuous dimension of unhealthy to healthy. And as she's doing that, I am starting to see patterns of what she values based on the level of healthiness or unhealthiness. Another example, another visual framework we can use is multidimensional plotting. Now we're getting fancy. This is multiple dimensions that we want to investigate and mapping concepts against multiple dimensions. Those dimensions are predefined, so you come in with the framework in mind, and you're having people plot based on those multiple dimensions. This is where you can see interactions happening, how different items and raw elements are interacting with different dimensions. This is also where you can start to see some of the patterns emerging. And this would be a signal for me to dive deeper into some of the patterns and clusters that I see. So what does a multidimensional plotting look like? Here, I've pre-planned a multidimensional plot with emotional on the vertical axis and on the horizontal axis, frequency. So maybe I would ask Paulina to come up and place each raw item, so each breakfast item, against how she feels about them and also how frequently she eats them per week. What you'll see is for consuming several times a week, for this example, we're already seeing two clusters happening. We're seeing that pancake and scrambled eggs she feels positively about and she eats frequently. Whereas protein shake and cereal and milk, she also eats frequently, but she feels less satisfied about. And so this would be a signal for me to probe deeper. I would ask, why is there a difference between the two? Why are there different clusters here? And perhaps the insight here would be that for the things that she feels positively about, it's actually because she has time in the morning to prepare them, and she feels like it's a treat for her. For the things that she doesn't feel passionate about, it's more grab-and-go options, and she has to just put up with it and go out the door. So this is really a good way to visualize some of the concepts in her mind. The last framework I'll talk about is story plotting. This is like storyboarding, very similar to journey maps that we use. So essentially, the participant is capturing for us key actions and events in an experience and also plotting out the emotional dimension along the way. And the goal here is for us researchers to understand what are the key elements and events that happen and also how they feel about them. So as an example, maybe I asked Paulina, how was her breakfast this morning? And I want her to tell me about her experience from having breakfast this morning. And so perhaps she woke up late, and she's running out the door, and fortunately, she opened up the pantry and noticed the last snack bar remaining in the pantry. And so her happiness goes up. She takes that snack bar, runs to work, eats it during a meeting, and then realizes she's still hungry, and her emotion drops. She decides briefly whether or not to buy more food or to wait for lunch, and then she decides, you know what, I will just have an early lunch instead. What you can see here is the emotional dimension and fluctuation along the way, as well as the key events that happen in that experience. I may also ask Paulina to name the different phases, and so starting that journey mapping process for us. By now, you're probably wondering, what's the difference between plotting and card sorting? In my mind, if we refer back to Design Council's Double Diamond, plotting is more living within the problem diamond, so the first diamond, where we're really understanding people's context and pain points and experiences. Whereas card sorting would be more living towards the solution diamond, the second diamond, where we have some ideas around the potential solutions that we want to dive into, and we're probing into people's mental models relating to concepts of our solution. Also, the goals are different. For plotting, the goal is to really inform exploratory research. I don't know why it didn't show up properly, but it should say inform exploratory research. And for card sorting, the goal is to inform information architecture, IA. Cool. what does plotting actually look like in actuality, in practice? I'm going to talk about a case study for an actual client project. So as Danny mentioned, I work in consulting for user research, and this is based on an actual client project that I did, where I used plotting. And so the brief from the client is they really wanted to understand how people pay and shop in order to spot pain points and opportunities to better design a good omni-channel shopping experience. So we had 4 weeks to do this. We chose a bunch of different methodologies, and one of those was 20 user interviews, exploratory interviews on a one-to-one basis. I asked the participants to tell me the stores that they go to and how they mentally categorize them. So here's an example of one person's responses and done through categorical plotting. So here you can see the different stores that they visit based on how they think about the purpose of those stores. So some of those stores, they will go for health and beauty, some for electronics, some to get multiple items, and so on. And this is also a good way for us to both now reference the same board and say, I want to ask more questions about Sephora. I want to dive deeper into your experiences at Sephora. Or I want to understand how you use Dollarama for home items. So this is a way for me to also reference which parts I want to dive deeper into. I also had people do story plotting about their most recent shopping experience. This person, unfortunately, had lots of ups and downs. So she really wanted to gather a couple of different items that she forgot to buy in her regular grocery shopping trip. And she added those to an online cart because she likes to do online shopping. She realized afterwards that some of the items didn't actually send to her address. So her emotion drops significantly. And this is because this is below the $50 minimum spend threshold for free shipping, and so she now had to scramble to find other things to add to her cart. Once she did that, she also realized a couple days later that the delivery was delayed. So she got her delivery a couple days later than expected, and so this cut out the entire purpose of shopping online in the first place. So you can really see both the emotional ups and downs that she experienced, but also the different phases of her shopping journey that she had. In relation to shopping, I also asked about loyalty programs. So I asked the participants to tell me about the different loyalty programs that they participate in, how frequently they use them, and how they feel about them. This is, again, a very good way for me to reference and say, I want to dive deeper into the programs that she uses several times a year and feels very good about, or the things that she doesn't use, or the programs that she uses every week. So after 20 interviews, as you can imagine, there's a ton of visual data, lots of plots that I've gathered. And then the process of synthesis happens. And this is an actual zoomed out view of our synthesis board. It was a lot of information. And after looking through 20 interviews, we were able to isolate personas and different journey maps and jobs to be done stories and opportunities for the client. Great. By now, you're probably thinking, plotting is cool. I want to try it out. How do I try it out? So I'll give you some tips and tricks for you to use plotting in your own practice. I would recommend plotting when you're doing exploratory research. So you're really in the first diamond. You're trying to understand the problem space, people's contexts and experiences, and you can use plotting to better understand their mental models that way. I also recommend plotting when you have multiple items that you need to probe deeper into. So in my case, breakfast items. And then if you want to look at relational connections between the items in people's minds. There's actually lots of benefits of plotting. First of all, it saves a lot of time because when both your interviewee and you are looking at the same board, you can all zoom in and hone in on specific areas that you want to dive into. Instead of asking the participant to tell you their entire life story, you can now zoom in and out of specific parts of the board. I also noticed that there was a marked improvement in people's engagement when they were doing interactive plotting. As you can imagine, sitting down and talking to you for 60 minutes could get very draining for people. And so when they're doing the interactive portion of plotting, you can see the delight in people's faces. They become really, really engaged. They also provide more details about their experiences that way. You can get a full range of the different items that you want to investigate. So in this case, I could get a full range of all the different breakfast items that I want to dive into, the full range spectrum of what I want to investigate. And finally, it makes synthesis a little bit easier because the frameworks are already there, and so you're essentially looking across the different frameworks from all your participants for repeatable patterns, themes, so on. The way that you use plotting is very similar to the way that we design research generally. We start with our research question. What are we trying to learn? We then decide what visual frameworks work best with our research question. Do I choose a multidimensional plot? Do I choose a story plot, etc.? Then I can pre-draft some questions in relation to my research question and also the visual frameworks that I've decided upon. So pre-draft some of your questions. You can conduct in an interactive way, have them plot out the different content pieces onto the visual framework that you presented, and then you can synthesize based on all the different frameworks from participants. So very similar to how we do research generally. Lastly, some tools and tips based on my own experience. Plotting can actually happen both physically or digitally. So physically, I've found that you can prepare a blank piece of paper or a whiteboard. All you have to do is draw out your visual frameworks ahead of time for each participant. And then you can have physical Post-it notes for them to note down their pieces of information, their raw notes, and then do the plotting that way. The only thing is, after each interview, you might have to digitize each of their responses so that you can do synthesis later on. If you opt for the digital way, I really like Mural and Mural. They now sound the same, but they used to be Mural and Real-Time Board. Yeah. And so I found those two tools to be really, really good for digital plotting as well. We talked a little bit about cognitive load and how it is very cognitively demanding for people to retrieve from their long-term memory. So if you are opting for your participant to note down their items, so their raw notes, please let them do that in silence. The last thing that you want is when they are retrieving, when they're thinking about what breakfast items that they enjoy eating, that you start asking more questions or you try to have a conversation and discussion because it is very cognitively demanding on their working memory. So try to let them recall things in silence if you opt for them to take down the items. Also, try to look away when they are recalling in silence because it can get a little bit self-conscious. People can get self-conscious if you are looking at them, staring at them as they're remembering items. I promise it will be short and sweet, and we are done. Thank you so much.